Welcome to this lecture on the European Union's external effects on global electronic waste governance. When did you buy your current mobile phone? What did you do with the old one? Did you pass it on to someone else who continues using it? Is it still sitting in a drawer somewhere at home? Did you throw it in the waste bin? Or did you bring it to an e-waste collection point? If you brought it to an e-waste collection point, do you know whether, where, and how it was recycled? Those questions illustrate the various things that can happen to electronic devices after we stopped using them. Since we use more and more electronics in all parts of our daily lives, and since all of them become waste at an increasingly fast rate, the question of how we deal with electronic waste grows in its importance. Electronic waste often is called e-waste, and it covers end-of-life products ranging from washing machines and computers to fluorescent light bulbs and smoke detectors. It is the fastest growing waste stream in most countries. E-waste is at the same time a precious resource and a dangerous threat to human health and the environment. If it is recycled appropriately, metals such as copper, gold, and aluminium can be recovered and reused. But if treated with suboptimal primitive methods or dumped in landfills, the hazardous substances that are contained in electronics, such as lead, mercury, and cadmium, can harm workers' health and contaminate the environment. It is thus of utmost importance to ensure that e-waste is collected and recycled properly to avoid any harm to humans and the environment. Although this sounds like a very local problem, e-waste actually has an important international dimension. E-waste regularly is exported to countries such as Ghana, China, and Thailand, where low-cost labor and often lax environmental policies make recycling cheaper than, for example, in the European Union or the United States. In many low-income countries, it often are unregistered businesses that recycle e-waste. This is called the informal sector, where sometimes even children use basic processes such as open-air incineration and acid baths to extract metals from e-waste. These processes emit furans, dioxins, and other pollutants that harm the workers, who often don't wear any protective gear, and that contaminate the air, soil, and water. Although e-waste exports to non-OECD countries are prohibited in the European Union, illegal shipments still happen today. E-waste generated in Europe can therefore have a tremendous impact on countries far, far away. This links to the strong environmental justice dimension of the e-waste problem, which the International Basel Convention tries to address. The European Union pioneered in adopting policy addressing the e-waste problem already as early as the 1990s. The EU started recognizing the problem, and in 2002 it adopted two directives: the Directive on Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment, which is called the WEEE Directive, and the Directive on the Restriction of Certain Hazardous Substances in Electric and Electronic Equipment, the so-called RoHS Directive. Meanwhile, those two directives have been reviewed and updated. Both directives aim to minimize the impact of e-waste on human health and the environment. The WEEE Directive aims to divert e-waste from landfills by making producers responsible for the end-of-life treatment of their products. This is called extended producer responsibility. The WEEE Directive also sets collection targets for EU member states and establishes recycling criteria. The RoHS Directive complements the WEEE Directive. by aiming to make electronics less hazardous. It bans a number of hazardous substances from electronics, but also contains some exemptions. The RoHS Directive is thus a product policy which prescribes product design, while the RE Directive is a process policy because it prescribes the process of collecting and recycling e-waste. While on the first sight, both directives sound very much like internal EU laws, but they have important external dimensions. EU internal policy can affect policies and practices in countries outside the European Union. This can be part of an explicit strategy, which would be part of EU foreign policy and external governance. But external effects can also occur as an unintended consequence of policies that were adopted to primarily address internal EU problems. The external dimension of e-waste policy started as unintended but very welcome consequence of internal EU policy. But over time, the promotion of such external effects has sometimes become intended. The external effects unfold through different mechanisms. Because the RoHS Directive defines how products should be designed, namely that they must not contain certain substances, it had an impact on the global production chains of electronics. This is different in the case of the process-related RE Directive. Here, the external effects consist more of learning from the EU's pioneering policy example. But learning also took place in the case of the RoHS Directive. Let's zoom into the example of the RoHS Directive. The RoHS Directive affected practices, policies, and strategies of both state and non-state actors outside the European Union's borders through economic interdependence and learning. Since the electronics industry is highly globalized, many companies do not develop products for the EU market only. Product components and product design are made for multiple, maybe even global markets. Since the EU market is large and attractive, manufacturers did not decide to no longer sell their products in Europe, but rather to comply with the RoHS Directive and to redesign their electronics. Because many of them are designed for many more markets than the European, it was easier to make entire supply chains RoHS compliant. In this way, the RoHS Directive shaped electronic manufacturers' practices, not only inside but also outside European borders. In addition, NGOs, policymakers, and a number of other actors closely studied the EU RoHS, but also the RE Directive. They learned lessons from the EU experience, and they used the EU directives as an argument to demonstrate that such ambitious policy is feasible and desirable. Let's now look at the RoHS Directive's effects on the United States of America as one example. The United States of America does not have a federal law restricting hazardous substances in electronics. Yet some of its states, most notably California and New Jersey, have adopted RoHS requirements that even explicitly refer to the EU RoHS Directive of 2002. The product scope of those laws is, however, more restrictive than the EU scope. This explicit citation of internal EU policy makes obvious that external effects of the EU on the US occurred. When we look at the timing of policy change in the EU and the subnational US level policy changes, we see that there seem to be similar developments in the US shortly after changes in the EU policy. Over time, half of the United States have adopted their own e-waste policies. Not many of them have restrictions on hazardous substances, but all of them established e-waste collection and recycling provisions. When looking at the timing, it is clearly visible that the trend of adopting e-waste policies started shortly after the adoption of the EU laws. In my own research, I found that many of the policymakers who adopted US e-waste laws drew lessons from the EU experience. But maybe, even more importantly, NGOs and business representatives brought their own lessons from the EU into the US policymaking process. Of course, domestic politics, economic structures, and policy preferences played an even more important role than the EU experience. These examples illustrate how internal EU policy can exert a multitude of external effects. Initially, many of the e-waste effects were unintentional but very welcome by EU actors. By now, it sometimes has become part of intentional EU foreign policy. The fact that the EU has ambitious and pioneering e-waste policy in place that contributed to shaping some external policies certainly influenced the EU in international negotiations, in particular in the context of the Basel Convention, which is about the transboundary movement of hazardous waste. With this web lecture, I illustrated how closely interrelated internal and external EU policy can be. It is not always part of an intentional strategy, but sometimes unfolds in surprising ways. Many thanks for watching and listening.